I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Oria James, and thank her for joining us today. Before turning it over to Oria, I'd like to give you a brief introduction. Oria James is currently studying for her bachelor's degree in global health and public policy at the University of Toronto. Oria's interests include hiking, kayaking, and finding new restaurants in downtown Toronto. Oria is an incredible advocate for people living with diabetes. She's participated in the World Diabetes Tour, a hiking trip through the Sierra Nevada mountain range with other young people living with diabetes. She's co-founded the College Diabetes Network chapter in Canada and became a co-director of the Diabetes Hope Foundation Symposium Planning Committee and has volunteered as a public speaker and advocate for Diabetes Canada. For more information on Oria, please read the speaker bio section to the left of your screen. So without further ado, I present to you Oria James.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Grace. Hello, everyone. As Grace mentioned, my name is Oria. I'm so excited to be here today to talk to you. Today I'm going to be talking about a subject that is pretty dear to my heart, and that is my journey with identity and diabetes. I am a student at the University of Toronto. I just finished my first year studying global health and public policy. This summer, I'm a summer student. At the moment, I'm taking an intriguing organic chemistry course. I'm originally from Victoria, BC. That is where my parents and my younger brother live. I am 19 years old, soon to graduate from the teenager club. And like generations of teenagers before me, I've spent time over the last few years worrying about how people perceive me, my outward appearance to the world, and how I would like the world to view me. Today, I'm going to be talking about diabetes and identity, my personal journey with diabetes acceptance and self-identification. Now, before I dive into my story, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the privileged life I've led with diabetes, for transparency, and also so that you understand a bit more about my background. I have grown up in a world with technology that allows me to have control over my blood sugar, and incredible parents with the means to provide me with the support I need to manage and afford living with diabetes. Although I have come up against stereotypes, misconceptions, and ignorance, I have no experience being discriminated against due to my diabetes, and I do not live with long-term complications of diabetes. To say that I had an identity crisis when I was first diagnosed with type 1 would be a lie. To be frank, I was a little too worried about dying to ponder philosophical thoughts, like the relationship between my identity and my diagnosis. When my father first came into my room when I was 10 years old to tell me that I had diabetes, my 10-year-old brain heard the die in diabetes and thought death. Immediate feelings included confusion. When I started in grade 5 at my French immersion primary school, one of the first things I did was give a presentation to my class about le diabète de type 1. I was labeled the diabetic girl. I had no choice of my own. I was the only child in the school with diabetes, and I was given special allowances because of it. But here I did not care. Life was okay. It was middle school that I really started to care about how people saw me. Middle school Oria was a self-described nerd, dedicated to high grades and pleasing teachers. It was this stage of my life when rejection of diabetes came out the strongest. I hated wearing my insulin pump where people could see it. I rebelled against any kind of diabetes fanny pack. I wanted no physical evidence on me that would reinforce my identity as the diabetic girl. I hid in my room and cried when my parents told our dinner guests about my diagnosis. I thought it was unnecessary and cruel, like a label had been slapped on me that read sick, special, slightly less human. Well-meaning people told me that I should not be eating sugar. They didn't offer me cake at birthday parties. They looked at me with sorrow in their eyes. I was the little girl whose body could not take care of itself. The laissez-faire attitude of grade 5 Oria had been replaced by one who cared deeply about how people perceived her. I wanted to be well-liked and beautiful, and I did not think that this was possible with diabetes. Through high school, I gave school-wide presentations about type 1 and began to speak about type 1 at the community level as well as at the school level. With all the stereotypes I faced and explaining I needed to do, I slowly became a strong and confident self-advocate. This was a transition period in my life. This time period is where I started to recognize that diabetes had given me skills that my peers had not yet developed. I began volunteering with Diabetes Canada, and through the connections here, I was able to get involved in public speaking, education, advocating for better diabetes care. I learned to love public speaking and the platform it gave me. Here, I found not only a community, but also full acceptance of the person I was. Now, this transition period is also where I had the most conflicting messages about how I should be viewing my diabetes. I had many people tell me that diabetes should never define me. I heard life with diabetes phrased in many different ways. Some said, diabetes just means that you are slightly more high maintenance. People told me that you're not different from anyone else. Don't let diabetes affect you. But on the other hand, I was constantly reminded that I needed to keep on my diabetes management 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for the rest of my life. That above all else, I needed to make sure my priorities in life started and ended with diabetes management. At school, I was well known because I had been vocal about diabetes. Diabetes was directly connected to how I saw myself and how the world saw me. Diabetes was my own personal platform. It was in high school that I was first told that I should not be referring to myself as a diabetic, and that instead I needed to start saying I was a person living with diabetes. This person-first language movement places an emphasis on the individual instead of on the disability or condition. But by this point in my life, I had spent over half a decade learning to love myself and proudly call myself a diabetic. I had successfully done a 180. I had gone from a frustrated and isolated 10-year-old that hated hearing the word diabetic to a teenager that wanted to shout it from the rooftops. I thought I had it all figured out, how I viewed myself and how others viewed me. This language change sparked my identity crisis moment. 7 long years after the diagnosis that changed my life, did I finally have a time where I felt completely lost, trying to find the relationship between my identity and my diabetes. The word diabetic didn't have negative connotations to me. I used the word diabetic to start conversations, address stereotypes, and connect with others. When people told me that I should change my language, I thought they were telling me that the word diabetic had connotations so negative that it was not worth the fight to address the stereotypes associated with it. I felt attacked. I felt like my journey to self-acceptance was being devalued. Fast forward to now, to today. The way I view myself as a person living with diabetes has not changed. I am confident and I am so proud of the fact that I have accomplished everything while living with diabetes. I realized that I spent too much mental energy looking at and analyzing the words and phrases that were being used to describe me, and not enough time thinking about the meaning behind them. The language change from diabetic to living with diabetes didn't mean that diabetes needed to be less connected to how I viewed myself or less connected to my self-identity. It did not mean that I shouldn't be proud of myself. Person first language shows that we are moving towards a world that is more accepting and less label-oriented, and I am so excited that I get to live through this change in our society. I remember how stuck I felt when I was moving through the world, letting a label weigh me down. The truth is, we have the power of choice when it comes to how we see ourselves in relation to the conditions we live with, no matter what language or words we choose to use. One of the disastrous yet beautiful things about being human is that the way we see ourselves affects the way we interact with the world around us. I believe in the power of change through mindset and self-identification. I believe that psychological ownership of disease is important for happiness. But to elaborate on this statement, this means I believe that we are allowed to see our diagnoses in the way that best suits our lives. If you want to see diabetes as one of the primary words of the story that makes up your identity, you are at liberty to do so. And you are just as free to see your diabetes as the small bit of extra maintenance that you need to attend to stay healthy. There is no one right way to live with diabetes, manage diabetes, and subsequently view diabetes. I also think it very important to mention that you do not need to subscribe to one way of seeing yourself. Change your mind to your heart's content, because this is how we grow. So, who am I? How do I see myself? I am a daughter, a sister, a student, a friend, a painter, a pianist, a hiker, a kayaker, a lover of the outdoors, a taker of naps, an eater of snacks. And I am also a young person living with diabetes. I am so proud of what it has made me today. After my diagnosis, I learned a lot of life lessons. Time management, extensive planning, the fact that actions have consequences. One of the lessons I hold dearest to my heart is to never judge a person because you don't know what's going on underneath the surface. On the outside, I am a happy young woman who's getting her degrees at school. But that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes lie in bed at night and cry because my blood sugars won't stabilize, or my infusion sets won't stop bleeding, or I haven't been able to sleep through the night in days due to low blood sugar, and it's exam season. I know very well that I am still young and I have a lot of life to experience. But I do know that our psychological freedom to choose the way we see ourselves can directly affect the way that we move through our lives. Don't lock up your mind where it does not want to be. For the time being, I am confident in who I am and how I would like others to perceive me as a young person living with diabetes. I truly wish all of you inner peace with any conditions that you may live with. And I want to remind you that although we cannot choose everything that happens to us, we can choose the way we would like to view ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oria. That was really great, really inspiring, and I think really helpful for others and how they can relate to their identity in terms of living with diabetes. So now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Elizabeth Moreau. So Elizabeth lives in Ottawa with her husband and 2 children, the youngest of whom was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2013 when she was 4 years old. Since then, Elizabeth has been involved in diabetes advocacy and education, primarily focused on supporting kids with diabetes in school. Along with several other moms, Elizabeth co-founded Support Ontario Students with Type 1 Diabetes to advocate for improved provincial policy for kids with diabetes. For more information on Elizabeth, please read the speaker bio section to the left of your screen. So without further ado, I present to you Elizabeth Moreau.
Thanks so much, Grace, and hello, everyone. One of the reasons I was excited about taking part in this webinar today was to hear from other speakers who are living with or dealing with type 1 diabetes. And Oria, I can't tell you what an inspiration it is to hear a young woman like yourself, so accomplished and with so much insight into what diabetes has meant to you, good, bad, and otherwise. So thanks so much for sharing that. We feel like you're a role model for a lot of our kids, so thank you. So as Grace said, my daughter was diagnosed in 2013. She was 4 years old. And when I was invited to take part in this and talk about overcoming challenges related to diabetes, I thought back to those initial early weeks and months after her diagnosis. There were so many challenges related to realizing your child has a lifelong serious illness, learning about diabetes management, the emotional toll it took on our family, navigating the implications on our home life, our jobs, our routine, and our other child. And underpinning all of that was a feeling that we had lost our sense of safety and security, because diabetes pulls the rug out from under your family, and it makes the world seem very unsafe all of a sudden. And though we're always conscious of the short and long-term risks associated with type 1, 5 years later, I don't feel that overwhelming fear anymore. So I'd like to talk to you a bit about how that happened in hopes that you can find something in my experience that might be helpful. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that were essential in overcoming the challenges related to diabetes for me and our family. The first was connection. The second was a contribution. And the third is celebration. So when my daughter was first diagnosed, I immediately wanted to find other parents who were living this experience, because as wonderful as our diabetes team is, I was pretty sure that other parents' experience of daily life would be helpful. It took a few months, but I found a Facebook group made up of Canadian parents of type 1 kids, and there I found people posting and commenting 24 hours a day about every aspect of diabetes management. The online diabetes community is incredibly rich and active, and there are groups and forums on very general issues or specific issues. People have very different reasons for connecting. For some, it's social. For others, it's a source of support or advice. And you can connect with people based on your treatment regimen or technology, geographic location, age, or more. You might find a group that meets your needs for a period of time, for example, if you have a toddler with diabetes. And then as you or your child move to a different phase, you'll probably find another one. When your child starts a new technology, such as a pump or a CGM, you might want to connect with people using those tools to share experiences or troubleshoot problems. When my daughter was diagnosed with celiac disease a year after her diabetes diagnosis, I wanted to connect with parents who were also dealing with both of those conditions, because it really is a unique experience. And then there are also lots of blogs and other places to read about people's firsthand experiences, and I've listed a couple here on the slide. So staying connected online also allows you to learn about opportunities for in-person events or gatherings, both informal or through organizations like Diabetes Canada or JDRF. A lot of parents self-organize. They arrange play dates to allow their children to meet other kids with diabetes or find babysitting. And so if you're not active online, your clinic might have pamphlets or posters about what's going on in your area, or you can connect with your local Diabetes Canada or JDRF office or chapter. So it was through those connections that I discovered the second essential element in overcoming challenges, and that was making a contribution. My daughter started kindergarten 5 months after she was diagnosed with diabetes, and other than the time immediately following diagnosis, it was by far the most stressful experience. So we're just getting used to managing diabetes, starting to feel some confidence, and we're faced with sending a 4-year-old off to school on her own. At the time, she was the only student with diabetes at her school, and neither her principal nor the teachers had any experience with type 1, which is pretty amazing given that kids under 5 are the fastest growing group of newly diagnosed cases. I spent most of that month of August preparing for the first day of school. There was so much to do, from gathering her supplies, arranging teacher meetings, staff training, meeting with our diabetes team for advice, and of course connecting with other parents online about our experiences with schools. And these were the kinds of questions that kept coming up over and over. What policies or protocols are in place at my school board? How do I ensure my child's needs are met, whether that's checking blood sugar, administering insulin, or ensuring she eats all of her meals and snacks? How do I get staff support, adult supervision? Who's going to train the school staff, and when are they going to do that? How do I make sure I get information back and forth from home to school every day? And how am I going to handle changes to the school routines, like special events or field trips? And what shocked me was how each of us was doing this on our own, year after year, one school at a time, one teacher at a time. And I thought, there really must be a better way to do this. My background is in communications and resource development, and I'm fortunate to work for a children's health organization. So I saw two gaps. One was in policy, and one was in information. So on the policy side, the questions were, how do we ensure that either provinces or school boards are mandating a minimum level and type of support for students with type 1, and that these decisions are not left up to individual principals or teachers, which leaves parents and kids extremely vulnerable. On the information side, how do we ensure that all school staff have up-to-date, accurate information about how to support kids with type 1 appropriate to their role and interaction with the students? So on the policy side, there were, and there still are to some extent, huge gaps in the kind of support that kids are entitled to at school. Not all provinces have policies on diabetes management at school, and without guidance at the provincial level, parents are left to advocate on their own. This is a really tall order when you already have a child with a chronic condition and you're stretched to the limit. On the information side, I saw parents creating their own information sheets and care plans and teacher training, a really labor-intensive process. Now, how much better would it be for people to have access to a central source of information that was consistent and credible? So two things happened. The first was, through those online connections, I met other mothers who were concerned about the lack of provincial policy in Ontario. Several of us decided to work together to try to change the situation. So we combined our experiences, our skills, our networks, and together we became Support Ontario Students with Type 1 Diabetes, or SOST1D for short. In 2014, we created a website, a Facebook page, a Twitter account, all at virtually no cost other than our time. And over the next several years, we advocated and encouraged others to advocate to the Ontario government for school support for our kids. And last fall, I'm happy to say that thanks to, in large measure, to Diabetes Canada's efforts, the Ontario government introduced a policy on prevalent medical conditions in schools. The second thing that happened was on the information front. Sorry, there we go. The organization that I work for, the Canadian Pediatric Society, partnered with Diabetes Canada and the Canadian Pediatric Endocrine Group to create an initiative called Diabetes at School. The goal is to ensure that parents and school staff have consistent, credible, up-to-date information to keep kids healthy and safe. We produced a bilingual website with a range of training and education materials for teachers and school staff, including text-based information, care plan template, high-low posters, and a series of animated videos. These initiatives made me feel that I was helping not only my daughter, but contributing in some small way to the experience of other parents who have children with type 1 diabetes. And it's been a way to cope with having this disease in our lives. Once you start to know the diabetes community, you'll see so many parents making important contributions. Some of them are potentially life-changing, like Ed Damiano, who's sorry, I'm just having trouble with some slides here. Ed Damiano is a biomedical engineer at Boston University who's developing an artificial pancreas. His son was diagnosed when he was 11 months old. Barbara Pasternak is an Ontario businesswoman and mother of 3 sons, 2 of whom have type 1, who created a foundation that awards scholarships to students with type 1. And Kaz and Rihanna Ahara are parents and filmmakers who produced a documentary about their family's experience with type 1, which started when their daughter Chio was diagnosed at the age of 2. And then there are the countless parents working behind the scenes. They're volunteering, they're fundraising for diabetes organizations, and they're mentoring newly diagnosed families, all helping to raise awareness about diabetes and helping other families to live easier with the disease. Not all of us are biomedical engineers, but we all have skills and abilities, ideas, networks that we can use to contribute to the diabetes community. Finally, the third C that's helped us overcome challenges is celebration. And especially in those early days and weeks after my daughter's diagnosis, I found it inconceivable to think that there would ever be anything to celebrate. But it turns out there were. At first, I found ourselves celebrating the firsts in diabetes management. That first sick day, the first birthday party, the first sleepover, the first vacation. Each of these diabetes milestones gave us confidence to face the next challenge and helped us see that our daughter didn't have to miss out on anything because she has diabetes. Many people celebrate diaversaries, marking the date of diagnosis as a way to celebrate their child's health. We participated in our community's annual diabetes walk. It's an important way to engage our friends and family in diabetes by walking with us or by donating. And that coming together as a community is a really important reminder that we're not alone. And finally, I never thought we'd laugh about diabetes, but we do. We joke about carb counts. We laugh about mom fails. And I hope that by telling my daughter that I've messed up, like the day I accidentally doubled her breakfast insulin, that I'll help her see that we can never be perfect when it comes to diabetes care. We all make mistakes, but we correct and we move on. So a diagnosis of type 1 comes with a lot of challenges, but there are ways to get past them or through them. And I think that what we're doing here today, by listening to others share their experiences, is a really important way of how we do that. So thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions or your experiences about how you've overcome challenges related to type 1. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was really great. Lots of really good information, and especially liked the piece at the end about not always being perfect. So I thought that was really great. So now it's time for question period. So feel free to submit your questions in the question box on the screen. And just please note that for all questions we're unable to answer today, please send us an email at webinars@diabetes.ca, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So the first question I have will be for Oria. So this person is living in Saskatchewan and living with type 1 diabetes. And what would you recommend in terms of how to get involved in advocacy initiatives, how to get started?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of different ways to go about this, but my biggest piece of advice is to go online and use social media. Elizabeth mentioned this. There's lots of resources out there. Start with Facebook, and if you're unable to find groups there, see if you can call up your regional diabetes chapter. The way that I got involved with advocacy really was I made contact with one person who worked at Diabetes Canada, and from there I was just proactive about opportunities. I asked lots of questions, I sent out lots of emails, and it flourished. People are always willing to take up your help. If you want to help out, I can assure you there are people that would like your help. It just starts with making that kind of first initial contact. And whether it's in person or in a phone call or an email or social media, it doesn't matter. You just gotta find your person, and I think from there it grows. A network can grow.
Amazing, thank you. And maybe I'll just also pass this question along to Elizabeth in terms of how parents can start to get involved in different community groups or advocacy initiatives for their children. Elizabeth?
Oh, I'm sorry, Grace. I would echo with what Oria said, and I would also suggest that people find an issue that really matters to them. There are so many aspects of diabetes and diabetes care that require advocacy. For me, it was a school issue because we were living with the prospect of sending a 4-year-old to school by herself. So that was really top of mind, and I was really motivated to get involved in that issue. Now, as she gets older, I'm starting to see other opportunities. So, find something related to diabetes advocacy that you really care about. And as Oria said, just make a phone call. There's so many opportunities to help.
Perfect, thank you. And Diabetes Canada does have a volunteer form that you can fill out if you are interested in volunteering or being an advocate for diabetes, especially in Ontario with the election coming up, if that's something you are interested in helping out with. So I have another question here for Oria, and the question is, this person is struggling with diabetes burnout or feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Is this something that you ever were challenged by, and how did you go about finding support?
This is something that I've experienced, and to be honest, I'm still learning ways to deal with it myself. But I think that one of the important things I've learned in dealing with burnout, or in dealing like I can't manage my diabetes anymore, is allowing yourself to forgive yourself and allowing yourself to have bad days. Me personally, I'm a bit of a perfectionist in the brain, and when I see those high or low blood sugars, it makes me frustrated with myself. But to take a step back and tell myself that it is okay to make mistakes, and it is okay to have bad days and bad weeks and bad months, kind of snaps me back into reality. It's, almost like a self-pep talk, and that allowing yourself to be unhappy, you're able to allow yourself to get back on it and find that happiness again.
That is really great advice. Thank you. This question is for Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, how can parents educate other parents without feeling like you're overwhelming them? Obviously, it can be overwhelming for the parents themselves of living with having a child living with diabetes. So how do you pass that information on to another parent, where maybe you're going to a birthday party or they're going for a sleepover, without feeling like you are overwhelming them?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you want to find this balance between ensuring that your child is included in every aspect of childhood. You don't want them to be excluded because people are afraid of the disease, but you want people to realize that this is a serious condition that that requires vigilance and care. So it really is finding a balance between making sure your child is safe and being reasonable with the other parent. I've always, in the last 5 years with birthday parties and sleepovers and things like that, I've always tried to make it as easy as possible on the other parent. I've given information on a need-to-know basis, made myself completely available, gone over to do the heavy lifting, if you will, the blood sugar checks, the insulin administration. It really depends on how well you know the person, I think, and that person's experience. If they have any experience in healthcare, judge the person and what you think they're willing to do. Even if the parent isn't willing to do anything, there's always a way to make sure that your child is included. It just might mean that you have to do a little more. It's also a way, and this was part of last week's webinar, to encourage a bit of independence depending on how old your child is. And if your child's very young, then you stay at those birthday parties. I was that mom who was at the birthday party until my daughter was about 8, and that was okay. That was okay. It was more important for her to be included. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but once you do it, you feel really good about it because your kid had a good time. And you know what? Sometimes they come back from the birthday parties and their blood sugar's 22. That's okay. You correct and move on. The important thing, what they will remember, is that they had a really good time.
Perfect. That is a great answer. Oria, I have a question from someone who is living with diabetes and is finding challenges in terms of managing their stress or anxiety while they're studying for school. Do you have any tips or advice for this person?
Oh, goodness. I just completed my first year of university, and this is a topic that has affected me a fair amount. I think that flexibility has to be one of your main priorities in terms of managing blood sugars with stress, and being patient with learning how your body adjusts. If your body is the type of body that goes high, has high blood sugars when you're stressed, maybe in exam week you put up that 10% basal rate every single day. Or if you go low a lot during exams, which is something that I experienced, I just needed to make sure that I had food right before bed and that I was eating snacks every few hours. One of the things with dealing with diabetes and stress, I think one of the main things is patience. I'm certainly not at a point where I perfectly know how to manage my blood sugars through stressful situations, but keep a little notebook or a diary. Write down what happens when stress comes into your life and what works, and just keep building off of there. Start building a knowledge base about yourself, and keep it written down in kind of real form, either on paper or on the computer, because your head, your brain can't carry it all.
Thank you. Okay, so this question, Elizabeth, how do you have any advice or tips on how to deal, not deal with, but when your child is looking to be more independent, how do you sort of go about managing that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's very personal. So, what I would say is that your team is super important, your diabetes team. That's the first place to go to for advice. But I think also you need to trust your own instincts as a parent is what I've felt. One of the things that I have experienced with school is feeling like others wanted her to be more independent before I was ready. And I think it's really important that it's right for all of you, whether it's doing certain tasks or adopting new technologies or whatever it may be. If everybody's on board, it's going to go a lot more smoothly. So I think it's very personal, but reach out to your team and try to support, your child in what it is they want to do, as long as you know that they're going to be safe. That would be my advice.
Perfect, thank you. And actually, Oria, I'll throw this one over to you as well. Do you have any tips as someone who was a teenager or someone, and maybe when you were looking to be more independent, how you sort of managed that balance between you and your parents?
I think the biggest thing I did through middle school and high school, it worked really well in terms of more responsibility with my parents, is that I was really straight up with them. I brought them the pros and cons list. I went into my diary and I said, this is what I want to do, and here's how and why I want to do it. If the kid, knows all the safety protocols and is confident in it, I say you let them take baby steps into doing it by themselves. But as the one with type 1, going in fully prepared with all the information was something that helped me and my parents with our relationship with diabetes and responsibility.
Perfect, thank you. So we'll finish off with one last question, and I'll ask it to Elizabeth first, and then maybe I'll get Oria's response as well. But the question is do you have any advice for how to deal with frustrating questions or comments from people who don't understand diabetes?
Yeah, wow, that comes up all the time in parent groups, and that's the exposure that I have. I'll be interested in Oria's answer as well. And I see a lot of parents getting really frustrated about questions that seem to be misinformed or perhaps insensitive, and so on and so forth. And then I think back to, the days before my daughter was diagnosed. I didn't know anything about diabetes. And honestly, I suspected she had diabetes, and I waited until the morning to go to her pediatrician's office. I didn't know that I should have been at the emergency room. I just didn't know. I thought maybe they'd send us home for a weekend and start us on insulin on Monday. I had no clue what was involved. So I kind of go back there and I say, you know what, I didn't know anything either. And if somebody says to me, oh, are her blood sugars stabilized? Well, I know that's kind of a silly question, but they just mean well. So I say, yeah, we have good days and we have bad days. So I try to, it depends on who the person is, if they're a family member or a stranger, but I try not to let it frustrate me, because most people just mean well, and it can be an opportunity to educate, or it can just be an opportunity to, look the other way. It really depends on where that person fits in your life, but we do get a lot of frustrating questions indeed. And, worst comes to worst, that's where you go online with your Facebook group and vent to the other parents, because everybody gets it and everybody's been there.
Oria, do you want to jump in and answer that question as well?
Yeah, I think I will. This is definitely an issue that I've come up against quite a bit in my life. And through my diabetes journey, I've learned to deal with it in a few different ways. I know I mentioned a little bit earlier, I had a lot of confusion and quite honestly hatred at the ignorance and the stereotypes and the misconceptions that kept slamming up above my face. It was about finding a coping mechanism for me. At first, my coping mechanism was to simply be angry, and that didn't work very well. And over the years, through self-advocacy and the need to explain, I felt that my coping mechanism is education, and also constantly reminding myself that it's not an attack and it's not personal. It's simply a lack of education or a lack of information. I think it's important to find the balance between addressing it and letting it go. You don't always have to address it, but if that education and setting that person right makes you feel better, you go ahead and do that.